Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the brainstem and the diencephalon. This is in chapter 14 of your textbook. So the brainstem consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The diencephalon is superior to the brainstem and is shown here in purple. And I'm sorry, this brain is actually facing the other direction. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the circumventricular organs. So let's start with the medulla. This is the most inferior portion of the brain. This area contains all of the ascending and descending tracts from the spinal cord. They run right through the middle of the medulla. And remember that ascending tracts are sensory tracts. Descending tracts are motor tracts. On the anterior surface of the medulla, you can see bulges that protrude out. These are the corticospinal tracts, the descending motor tracts that control the voluntary movements of the limbs and trunk. 90% of the neurons in these tracts cross over in the medulla. This is called the pyramid of decussation. This is where the corticospinal tracts, the motor tracts that are descending from the brain down to the limbs and the trunk, cross over from one side to the other. You can see that here. The medulla also contain areas called nuclei. Remember, a nuclei is a collection of cell bodies within the CNS. We already learned about ganglions. The dorsal root ganglion was a collection of cell bodies in the PNS that was on the dorsal root, and it contained the cell bodies of the unipolar neurons that was bringing sensory information into the spinal cord. So the nuclei is pretty much the same thing, a collection of cell bodies, but this time it's in the CNS. And if you think about the types of neurons that are in the CNS, those are the interneurons, which are multipolar neurons. So if the cell bodies are all together, there's a lot of dendrites and a lot of synapsing happening in these nuclei. There are two important nuclei within the medulla. The first one is the cardiovascular center, and this is the area that regulates the rate and the force of the heartbeat. It also regulates your blood vessel diameter. The other important nuclei is the respiratory center, and this is going to help adjust the rate of your breathing depending on the needs of the body. There are also reflex centers within the medulla. These are nuclei that control certain reflexes. And remember, a reflex is a sudden, unplanned, but very predictable series of events. So the reflex centers include the vomiting center. If you've ever had something go down your throat or stick in the back of your throat, it causes a vomiting reflex. There's also a deglutition center, which triggers the swallowing reflex. We also have reflex centers for sneezing, hiccuping, and coughing within the medulla. On the lateral sides of the medulla are two swellings called olives, one on each side. The inferior olivary nucleus is inside the olive, and these areas receive input from the cerebral cortex, the red nucleus, and the spinal cord. These areas route this information to the cerebellum and help make adjustments to motor activity. On the posterior side of the medulla are ascending tracts. These are sensory tracts that are bringing somatosensory information from the body. Remember that somatic sensations are touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception. So on the previous page, we were talking about the anterior side of the medulla, and we were talking about the descending tracts and how they cross over on their way back down to control the voluntary movements of the trunk and limbs. On the posterior side, however, we have the ascending tracts, which are bringing the somatic sensory information in. These tracts are called the gracile fasciculus and the cunate fasciculus. And each of them are going to synapse with a nucleus. The gracile fasciculus synapses with the gracile nucleus, and the cunate fasciculus synapses with the cunate nucleus. I'm sorry, I wrote nuclei there. It's the nucleus. Information they are bringing up to the cerebrum will synapse on the posterior side of the cord in these nuclei, and the synapsed neurons form a tract that brings the information to the thalamus, where it gets processed and routed to the proper areas of the brain. The tract that takes the information from these nuclei to the thalamus is called the medial lemniscus. The entire pathway, including the white columns of the spinal cord, is called the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. Any somatosensory information coming up through the brain is going to pass through the posterior side of the medulla in these tracts and be routed to the thalamus via the posterior column medium lemniscus pathway. You can see the bulges on the posterior side of the medulla in this drawing. The cunate fasciculus and gracile funiculus are those two ascending tracts that synapse with the medial lemniscus tract. The pons is the bridge between various areas of the brain. It links the medulla to the midbrain and the brainstem to the cerebellum. There are two regions, the ventral and the dorsal
section
region
of the brain.
The dorsal region is similar to the other parts of the brainstem. These contain the ascending and descending tracts running from the spinal cord to the brain. The ventral region contains the pontine nuclei.
Let's look at a posterior view of the brain. The pontine nuclei serve as a synaptic relay station between the cerebral cortex on one side of the brain and the cerebellum on the other side. You can see the tracts that go from the cerebral cortex here through the pontine nuclei to the opposite hemisphere of the cerebellum. The pons also contains the pontine respiratory group, which works with the respiratory control center of the medulla to help control breathing. The midbrain is the most superior portion of the brainstem. On the anterior side of the midbrain are the cerebral peduncles. These are structures that contain motor tracts that are bringing nerve impulses from the motor cortex to the body. So these are descending tracts. On the posterior side is the tectum. These are projections that make up the two superior and two inferior colliculi, one on each side. These control various visual activities. The superior colliculi are the visual reflex centers used for tracking images. The inferior colliculi are the auditory reflexes. Together, they control the startle reflex. In the startle reflex, you might hear a loud sound behind you or see something suddenly moving in your peripheral vision. The startle reflex will make you jump and turn your head and focus your eyes on whatever it is that you just heard or saw. Moving on to the diencephalon. This is an internal structure deep within the cerebrum. It is made up of four structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the circumventricular organs. We'll start with the thalamus. Remember from lab that the thalamus is made up of two paired egg-shaped structures that are connected by the interthalamic adhesion. The thalamus serves as the gateway for all sensory information, except for smell. Its job is to prioritize amongst all the impulses that are coming in, all the sensory impulses, and determine which ones are the most important. It also helps to relay motor impulses and is important in consciousness. The hypothalamus is located in the third ventricle beneath the thalamus. It's connected to the pituitary gland via a stalk called the infundibulum, and it contains many different types of nuclei. And the hypothalamus is very important. It is the control center for many of the homeostatic loops in the body. Sensations for somatic as well as visceral senses are received by the hypothalamus, as well as some of your special sensations of vision, taste, and smell. The hypothalamus controls the set point for body temperature and activates the thirst and hunger centers. It also controls the autonomic nervous system, the involuntary motor system, which regulates cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and the activities of many glands. Together with the limbic system, the hypothalamus is involved with some of our strongest emotions, such as rage, aggression,
pleasure, and sexual arousal. The hypothalamus produces several hormones and controls and is connected via the infundibulum to the pituitary gland, which also produce many hormones. It is also involved with the regulation of circadian rhythms, and it sets your sleep and wake cycles. The epithalamus is on the opposite side, up here, as the hypothalamus. This is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon, and it contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland produces melatonin. Melatonin helps to make you sleepy at night. The pineal gland works in conjunction with receptors in the eye to tell when the light is fading. When the light starts to fade, it produces more melatonin to make you sleepy. As the light starts to get brighter again, it stops producing as much melatonin and you tend to wake up. The last part of the diencephalon are the circumventricular organs. These are found in the wall of the third ventricle, and it contains parts of other structures like the hypothalamus and the thalamus. And it is important in homeostasis. It monitors various levels such as fluid balance, hunger and thirst, and works with other structures to help maintain and control homeostasis. That's it for today. See you in class.